There was one question that came up over and over on Parliament Hill this week.
But you've been asked several times and you won't answer. Do you have confidence in the Trudeau government as they stand now?
I will be clear again. We have absolutely ripped up the agreement with Justin Trudeau, and that means an election is more likely.
Clear. That's not clear. You're equivocating.
And an election, whenever that election comes, we'll be ready to fight it.
The NDP has been effectively bound to the Liberals on every important vote over the past 2.5 years. That agreement, he mentioned, is why. And now that Jagmeet Singh has ripped it up, the NDP has a brand new power, the power to topple the government and trigger an election. The question is, will they? And if so, when? Before the NDP pulled out of this deal, Canada's election was scheduled for October 2025. And the government was clear. They wanted to keep it that way. But that seems a lot less likely now that the NDP has pulled its support. Jagmeet Singh freely admits this.
Well, as I've said, I've ripped up the agreement with Justin Trudeau, and I know that means that an election is now more likely as a result.
But more likely is as far as he'd go. So we spoke to a whole bunch of people. Experts, analysts, pollsters, university professors, to try to get as full a range of answers as possible to that million-dollar question. If an election is coming earlier than expected, when will it come? Let's start with the earliest possible scenario.
The probability of having an election has increased a lot, not just a bit, but a lot, to have an election in the fall.
As soon as Parliament resumes business in the fall, the official opposition almost certainly will call a vote of non-confidence.
Yeah, now, a vote of no confidence is pretty much what it sounds like. An opposition party can, at basically any time, force a vote in the House of Commons that could bring down the government and trigger an election. Usually, in a majority government, the opposition doesn't have the numbers to actually pull it off. But in a minority, different story. So 2.5 years ago, the NDP agreed to support the Liberals every time one of these votes came up. And in exchange, the Liberals helped the NDP push through a bunch of stuff that they wanted. This is how the Liberals managed to survive. Even just a couple of months ago, when the Conservatives put forward one of these potentially election-triggering motions on a carbon tax bill.
Why don't we just end the debate and let Canadians decide and have a carbon tax election?
And everyone we spoke to agreed. The Conservatives may very well try this again as soon as they can.
Poilievre, I think, has a space to play here where he comes in and puts a lot of pressure on the NDP for saying, if you don't want to be in this deal with him anymore, well, then why don't you vote no confidence?
So with Jagmeet Singh making such a show of breaking ties with the Liberals,
Trudeau's Liberals can't deliver change.
the NDP could decide to vote against the government at the earliest available opportunity. If they did, there'd be like a 5-week campaign and an election could come as early as October. That's pretty fast.
I would say it's a 50-50 chance because I have listened to the video of Jagmeet Singh and his press conference, and he has repeated over and over and over that Canadians should be prepared for an election.
Everyone we spoke to agreed he does sound like he's ready to start campaigning, but consider the position the NDP is in right now and how long they might need to recover. So in the polls, they're pretty far behind, both the Conservatives and the Liberals. And according to one recent survey, more than 30% of respondents said their opinion of Singh and the NDP has actually gotten worse since 2022 when that deal with the Liberals was struck.
They're hearing constituents saying, we're tired of this government and you seem to be holding it together. You're with them. You're in bed with them.
They need some time to rebrand themselves.
So recasting the NDP in a different light, shedding that image of being a Liberal partner, yes, that might take some time. But also consider how else a fall election might be bad for the NDP. These are provincial elections slated for October. Elections where the NDP machine is fundraising, campaigning.
They are under threat from the rise of the BC Conservatives. David Eby needs to have every single NDP resource going towards that provincial campaign between now and October.
That means staff, volunteers, many who do double duty, who work both provincial and federal elections. To do both at the same time, that's tough. Consider how much of the NDP's agenda is close to becoming law, but not quite there. Pharmacare is a big one. Liberal and NDP cooperation has pushed it through the House, but not the Senate. Calling an early election might jeopardize quite a bit.
If an election is called immediately and Poilievre comes in and rips that up, then that's the end of the big gains that the NDP has used to justify entering into this blind confidence arrangement.
So the NDP may very well decide they're not ready for a fall election. They'd rather buy some time. But how much time do they actually need? So right now, they're a full 25 points behind the Conservatives in the polls. So if they're trying to actually form government, yeah, that's a pretty big gap to close. But they're only 8 points behind the Liberals.
My sense is that Singh's ambition is to become the leader of the official opposition.
Even if it means a Conservative majority government, if the NDP was the official opposition, that's an outcome they would happily take.
So the question then becomes, is it possible for Singh to bridge that 8-point gap by the end of this year? In theory, yeah, the NDP has done it before. In March of 2011, Jack Layton's NDP were also polling about 8 points behind the second-place Liberals. Just over a month later, they managed to flip that gap and were polling 8 points ahead of the Liberals going into the election.
Canadians have asked New Democrats to take on more responsibility in Parliament. For the first time in our history, they have asked us to serve as Canada's official opposition.
Now, different leader, different circumstances, we get it. But the point is, a big reversal in politics isn't impossible.
The challenge is to come up with a really transformative agenda that really differentiates them from the Liberals. Imagine they said, we need a guaranteed annual income. That's a bold new policy initiative.
So if they have moved up a little bit, if they're closing the gap on the Liberals, maybe they're even in second place in the polls, then the NDP might think that a campaign in the winter could be worth it.
And there is a built-in time pressure that lends itself to a winter election, because while the NDP can take time to rebuild, they're also going to get hammered by the Conservatives if they prop up the Liberal government for too long.
So my message to sellout Singh is this: commit today to voting for a carbon tax election at the earliest confidence vote in the House of Commons.
If there is a real appetite for change and the NDP is perceived as being dragging its heels because it's not yet ready, that could certainly hurt them.
Because Singh didn't just come out and say, this deal has run its course, it's time to move on. He called Trudeau selfish, he called him weak, and said he's ready to fight. So every time he votes to keep the government intact, not triggering an election, he's going to have to explain why.
These things that he said about Trudeau are serious, right? If he really believes that Trudeau is all for the corporate sector and not for the people, well, then what the heck is he going to do supporting them anymore?
So one opportunity the NDP could pinpoint as a way of triggering a winter election would be if the government puts out another fall economic statement, like they've done the last few years.
Typically, anything that has to do with money, with a budget, with estimates, appropriations are considered matters of confidence.
And if a vote is a matter of confidence, that's a chance to topple the government. But here's where some of the experts we spoke to wonder if there might be a compelling argument for Jagmeet Singh to bide his time even further still, especially if he feels like the threat of an election gives him leverage to extract concessions from government.
I wonder if there's a scenario around the fall economic statement where we see some politics from Jagmeet Singh, and he says, look, I'll support you, but you got to do this, this, and this, which I think would be good for the NDP, show people what you want to stand up for, and buy himself some time, which frankly, I think he needs.
Okay, so let's say spring rolls around. Jagmeet Singh has had half a year to differentiate himself. The snow's starting to melt. The Conservatives are still pressing the NDP to topple the government. And then the Liberals throw their annual budget into the mix.
If you don't pass a budget, you can't govern, right? So a budget is a matter of confidence. It is always a matter of confidence.
Historically, failing to pass a budget has been one of the most common reasons for minority governments to fall. In fact, it's what happened to Trudeau's dad in 1974. And in this case, all of the analysts we spoke to said the NDP might not have much of a choice here. It might become risky for the NDP to vote for the Liberals' next budget after everything Singh has said over the past few days.
Justin Trudeau has let Canadians down. And Canadians are done with his endless disappointment and delay.
Because a budget vote isn't just about one issue, one bill, or even a handful of spending priorities. It's a vote on the Liberals' entire agenda for the year to come.
People actually pay attention to it, and so people are waiting to see what the reactions are for the opposition leaders, and if there's there's drama around it.
Voting down the government in the spring probably makes a lot more sense than trying to swallow their pride a little bit and back them for another little while.
So, could we see a spring election? Well, at this point, according to most of the people we spoke to, it's probably the most likely scenario because it gives the NDP 5 or 6 months to get ready, to carve out their own position, and to avoid the risks we laid out of calling an election too early. And the budget gives them a pretty good opportunity to really take a stand, to say, we tried to get the Liberals to put X, Y, Z into the budget, but they didn't, so let's go to the polls.
So that would be, I would say, the big date to look at the budget, which will be presented, we don't really know, March, April, maybe May.
The Liberals could, of course, also go to the Bloc Québécois to try to get some support to keep the government alive. But there's not really much that can be gained out of that for either the NDP or the Bloc Québécois, because anything that's in the budget will end up getting undone by the Conservatives within 12 months.
But what a tough thing to predict, right? Singh's political calculations will be shifting constantly. He'll be watching the polls. He'll be watching the upcoming by-elections and provincial elections to see how his party does. He's also watching the US election.
Well, these could be judgment calls, right? To kind of estimate how they believe the public is feeling about their current situation, how much they want change, and when would be an appropriate time to do that.
And just to throw one more variable into all of this, Trudeau himself could decide to call an election at any time he wants as well. So while spring might seem most likely right now, every single season from now until next fall is on the table.